The hum of the engines was steady, almost hypnotic, as the plane cut through the night sky. Passengers shifted in their seats, some drifting into uneasy sleep, others glued to glowing screens or fiddling with the little cups of soda balanced on plastic trays. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like the kind of ordinary flight that would blur into memory within hours of landing. But inside, a quiet storm was already building, one that most of those on board didn't yet sense. Row 17 was where Mara sat. She had boarded with no fuss, eyes down, her jacket pulled tightly around her shoulders. She was the kind of passenger no one noticed, by design. Her hair tied back, no makeup, posture closed and like she wanted the world to pass her by. A businessman 2 seats over barely glanced her way, dismissing her as another tired traveler. That was fine by Mara. She had learned long ago the advantage of being underestimated. She traced the condensation on her plastic cup with one finger, pretending to listen to the tinny music in her headphones. In reality, every sense was tuned to the shifting rhythm around her. The man in row 14, who kept checking his watch. The pair near the emergency exit whispering too much, eyes darting toward the flight attendants. The bulky passenger in row 20 whose jacket seemed strangely weighted for a cabin that was already warm. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. Years of training buried deep, like a second heartbeat. When it began, it wasn't with a scream or a weapon raised high. It began with silence, the kind of silence that swallows everything whole. One of the whispering men stood, moved into the aisle, and without hesitation drove his fist into the nearest flight attendant's stomach. She folded with a choked cry, and before anyone could react, another man was already in motion, yanking her upright, pressing a blade to her throat. Gasps erupted, people fumbled for seatbelts, a baby started to wail. The man with the watch barked out orders in a thick accent, his voice amplified by fear. "Nobody move. Nobody speak." His words ricocheted through the cabin like bullets. And just like that, the flight became something else. A cage. Mara's body stilled. Her mind, however, quickened. The first man, the one at the front, had control. The second had the leverage, the hostage. The third was moving down the aisle now, his hand dipping beneath that weighted jacket. A gun, Mara guessed. Crude, smuggled through some gap in airport security. She cataloged it all in seconds, her breathing steady. Around her, passengers broke down fast. A mother clutched her son to her chest, sobbing apologies into his hair. The businessman who had dismissed Mara moments earlier raised his hands so quickly his cufflinks jingled. A teenager pulled out a phone until one of the hijackers kicked it from his hands. The fear spread like smoke, thick, choking, unavoidable. And Mara? She sat there, eyes lowered, lips pressed shut. The leader's gaze scanned the cabin, sharp and hungry. He wanted resistance, needed it even, to fuel his control. When no one gave it, he struck the seat back in front of him with the butt of his weapon. "You obey," he snarled, "or people die." Every muscle in Mara's body urged her to act, but she did not. Not yet. Timing was everything, and timing was what she owned. So she stayed silent, fingers brushing the zipper of her jacket, pulse measured. The third hijacker reached row 17. His eyes swept past her without pause, landing on the man across the aisle, who was fumbling to lower his gaze. The hijacker snarled, shoved the barrel of his gun against the man's temple, and barked something in a language most of the cabin didn't understand. Mara understood enough. Intimidation. Control. Theater. Her hand itched, but she stayed still. 2 rows behind her, another man had been quiet all this time, his broad shoulders relaxed, face tilted toward the window, as though bored. Anyone watching him might have thought he was another businessman, maybe ex-military, given his composure, and they would have been close. But not quite. Commander Daniel Weller of the U.S. Navy SEALs was not in the business of looking dangerous when there was no gain to it. His passport said consultant. His seatmate thought he was traveling for business. In truth, Weller was between assignments, bone-tired, hoping for nothing more than a drink and some rest before his next deployment. He hadn't expected this flight to demand more of him than patience. But the second the hijacker's fist connected with that flight attendant, his instincts lit up like a flare. Now, As he watched the gunman press cold steel against a trembling passenger's head, Weller's mind was already at work. Number of hostiles, approximate weapons, positions, timing. He needed an ally, someone the hijackers wouldn't suspect, someone who could move when he moved. That was when his gaze fell on Mara. At first, she seemed like the least likely candidate. Hunched, small, silent. But then he saw her eyes. Not wide with fear like the others. Not darting desperately for escape. Focused. Measuring. Controlled. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who had been here before. Not here exactly, but somewhere just as dark. The decision came quick. He couldn't do this alone, and she was his best chance. The next pass of the hijacker brought him close enough. Weller shifted, slow and smooth, and when the man's attention flicked elsewhere, he slid his hand across the narrow aisle, palm flat, against his leg. Nestled against it was the cold weight of a compact sidearm he had smuggled through less than official channels. His eyes caught Mara's. Just a flicker. A question. Her lips didn't part. Her body didn't shift. But in her gaze, a fire lit. Quiet, dangerous, resolute. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The gun pressed against her palm under the cover of shadow, and the balance of power on that plane began to shift, though none of the hijackers had noticed yet. For now, the silence held. But silence has a way of breaking. The hijackers were growing restless. Their eyes flicked from passengers to crew, scanning for compliance or defiance. But Mara remained a quiet anomaly. Her posture was relaxed, almost casual, yet every muscle was coiled ready. She didn't fidget. She didn't whisper. She didn't blink at the chaos around her. To the untrained eye, she was just another scared traveler. But to Weller, she was the single person on that plane who could make the difference. The first man, the one controlling the aisle, took a step forward, shifting his weight like a predator testing prey. The hostage in his grip whimpered, knees weak under the pressure. Mara's hand tightened around the gun. Not in panic, not in haste, but in readiness. She had trained for moments like this, though never in a commercial cabin full of unarmed civilians. Weller leaned subtly toward her, keeping his movements imperceptible. "Remember," he murmured, almost silently. "Observe first. Move only when I do. Eyes, ears, instincts. You know this." Mara didn't respond verbally. Her eyes flicked to the emergency exits, the overhead compartments, the tray tables, the angles of light reflecting off the metal surfaces. Everything mattered. Every shift of weight, every twitch of muscle, every subtle sound of the pressurized cabin. The second hijacker moved down the aisle, closer to the midsection. He checked the seatback pockets, ignored the children playing quietly, his gaze locking on the middle-aged man in row 12. The man's hands were raised but trembling, fingers pressed against the plastic armrests. The hijacker's voice was a harsh, guttural command. "Sit. Sit now. Move, you die." The cabin was tense enough to choke on. Sweat glistened on foreheads, and phones, forgotten in pockets, vibrated against thighs like warning bells. A mother tried to hush her infant, whispering reassurances that were hollow even to her own ears. Mara's eyes swept over every detail, filing each one away. Each observation could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. A scuffle broke out near the back. A passenger tried to leap up, perhaps to help, perhaps to run. The hijacker nearest him responded with brutal efficiency, striking him across the shoulder with the flat of his blade. The man crumpled silently, and the cabin collectively flinched. Fear was contagious. Panic was now a tangible, physical presence. Mara's chest remained steady. Her mind, sharper than any fear, cut through it all like a scalpel. Then Weller's voice came again, low, controlled. Now, it was the signal she had been waiting for. Mara shifted imperceptibly, the gun sliding forward in her grip, the weight of it settling into her hands like it had been there all her life. Not an ounce of hesitation, not a whisper of doubt. The first hijacker, eyes still on the hostage, didn't notice the movement. Not yet. Mara's training kicked in. She moved as if in slow motion, aligning her stance, grounding her feet against the aisle floor. She could feel the subtle vibrations of the fuselage beneath her, the hum of the engines as they sliced through the night sky. Every detail fed into her calculation, Timing, distance, angle, momentum. The hijacker pressed his blade harder against the hostage, sensing impatience, needing control. He didn't know that Mara's focus had already mapped his exact trajectory, that her fingers were already poised to disrupt it with precision. And then, as if on cue, Mara acted. A sudden shift of weight, a controlled step to the side, and the nearest hijacker found himself off balance. Mara's elbow snapped forward, not wildly, not recklessly, but perfectly timed. It connected with the man's throat, a precise and devastating strike. He staggered back, eyes wide with surprise, dropping the blade onto the aisle floor with a metallic clatter that rang through the cabin. The passengers gasped, some shrieking in terror, others frozen in disbelief. The mother holding the crying infant pressed her hand over her mouth, wide-eyed. A teenage girl across the aisle gripped her armrest as if the metal could anchor her to reality. But Mara didn't pause. She was already moving, sliding her body along the narrow aisle, every motion calculated. Weller followed seamlessly, his own movements fluid and controlled. He engaged the second hijacker with a clean, precise arm drag, using the element of surprise and momentum rather than brute force. The man went down hard against the galley wall, groaning but contained. Mara's eyes were still locked on the leader. The cabin had transformed from chaos to tense standoff in seconds. The hijackers, trained in intimidation but not prepared for this level of professional response, began to hesitate. Fear crept into their movements, small but unmistakable. Amateurism under pressure is lethal, and the leader was starting to feel it. His confident sneer faltered, replaced by uncertainty. Mara kept her attention divided, tracking the third hijacker across the aisle. He was skilled, yes, but predictable. Every amateur carries telltale signs, small cues that reveal intent. Mara had trained herself to read them. A hand brushing the jacket, a foot shifting slightly, a flicker in the eyes. She noted each one, filing them in the mental ledger she had kept since boarding. "Don't move," she said, voice steady, low, almost conversational. Not a shout, not a warning, just calm authority. It carried in the small, pressurized cabin like a knife through fog. The hijacker froze, uncertain. His fingers tightened on the improvised weapon. Mara's gaze never wavered, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The passengers, sensing the change, pressed back into their seats, holding breath after breath. The infant quieted slightly, the mother trembling but holding fast. The teenager lowered her phone, realizing that what she was witnessing was something larger than herself. Weller moved again, signaling Mara without words. Left, right shift. Each hijacker's reaction was measured and immediate, yet they had no frame of reference for the precision and experience in the movements confronting them. The leader barked orders, but the cabin had become a trap for them. Every step they took was anticipated, every move countered. The first hijacker lunged toward the galley wall, intent on regaining control, but Mara intercepted him. Her left arm swept, hooking his legs, and gravity did the rest. He hit the floor with a heavy thud, momentarily stunned. The second man attempted to recover, only to feel Weller's arm press down and redirect his momentum. He staggered, helpless, as plastic ties snapped around his wrists. The leader, now panicked, held the hostage tighter. His voice rose, cracking, demanding compliance. But Mara didn't flinch. Not her first instinct. Not her last. Her eyes tracked his every micro-expression, every tension in his shoulders, every microsecond of imbalance. "Drop it," she said, voice still calm, measured, almost polite. "One wrong move, and you won't get a second chance." He hesitated. Seconds stretched like hours. The cabin was suspended in a fragile moment of pure focus. One breath, one misstep, and it could all collapse. But the tide had already turned. Mara and Weller had shifted the narrative. What had begun as terror was now controlled chaos, the hijacker's confidence dissolving under the weight of real experience. Then, in one fluid motion, Mara advanced. Her gun, steady in both hands, was not a threat to the passengers, but a silent statement of resolve. The first hijacker raised his weapon instinctively, only to find himself already on the floor, restrained. The second followed. The leader's eyes widened, realization dawning too late. Weller moved behind him, hands decisive, and the hostage was released, tumbling safely to the aisle floor. Silence, sudden and absolute, fell over the cabin. The passengers stared in shock, awe, disbelief. Mara's hand lowered, gun still steady, but no longer threatening. Weller exhaled softly, brushing a hand across his shirt, maintaining composure as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. Mara sat back, pulling her jacket around her again, settling into her seat, as if she had never moved. The cabin, still trembling from adrenaline, looked upon her differently now. The quiet woman who had said nothing, who had been invisible in row 17, had just rewritten the rules of survival. The cabin was quiet, but the silence was heavy, not from fear anymore, but from disbelief. Passengers' eyes lingered on Mara, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The woman who had sat quietly, unnoticed, had acted with precision and courage when it mattered most. Ordinary travelers stared at her as if she had stepped out of a legend, a hero in plain clothes. Weller moved through the aisle, checking on the restrained hijackers and the passengers alike. His voice, calm and authoritative, reassured the frightened while coordinating the next steps. Communications with the cockpit and air traffic control were underway, diverting the plane to a safe location. Iceland had been chosen for its military support and a runway long enough for emergency procedures. Mara adjusted her seat, letting herself exhale fully for the first time. Her hands were steady, pulse normal, but the adrenaline still buzzed faintly under her skin. She had done what she was trained to do, what she had always known she could do. The passengers, meanwhile, were only beginning to process the enormity of the moment. The man who had mocked her before boarding, the one who had joked about motor pools and tires, finally found his voice. I owe you my life," he said quietly, the words barely audible above the subdued murmurs of the cabin. His usual arrogance had vanished, replaced by raw respect. Mara simply nodded once. "You don't owe me anything," she replied. "We all misjudge what we don't understand." The flight attendants began to regain composure, checking on passengers and assessing the minor injuries. Sarah, the young woman who had been pressed against the blade, was shaken but unharmed, her eyes still wide as she absorbed the truth of what had just occurred. Mara caught her gaze briefly and offered a small, reassuring nod. No need for explanation. Some lessons were better understood through action than words. The passengers began to whisper to one another, recounting in hushed tones what they had seen. The quiet woman in row 17 had become unforgettable, a symbol of courage they had never anticipated. Some reached out for acknowledgement, attempting to catch her eye, perhaps seeking closure or an answer. Mara returned to her book, the weight of the pistol now just a memory in her palm, as if the last few hours had been a rehearsal she had long prepared for. Outside the aircraft, emergency vehicles lined the tarmac as the plane touched down with precision. The wheels met the runway, tires screaming against wet concrete, reverse thrusters engaged, and the aircraft settled like a controlled giant. Rain hammered the windows, distorting the glow of flashing lights into rivers of liquid color. Passengers remained in their seats, absorbing the reality of survival, holding onto the normalcy of restraint belts while chaos unfolded beyond the cabin doors. The hijackers were escorted off the plane, restrained and under heavy guard. One unconscious, others conscious, but clearly shaken by the unexpected resistance they had encountered. The passengers watched silently, many still too stunned to move, their eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude, relief, and awe. Weller approached Mara as the doors opened, extending his hand, not in ceremony, but in the grip of warriors, thumbs locked, pressure firm. "Ever consider contractor work?" he asked, voice low but filled with earnest respect. Mara's reply was brief but deliberate. "I'm done with that life." The SEAL nodded, understanding. Some battles are fought only once, but the impact lasts a lifetime. He released her hand, merging into the controlled chaos of investigators, officials, and emergency responders who swarmed the aircraft. Mara stepped down the stairs into the Icelandic rain, feeling the cold water soak through her jacket, cleansing the tension, the fear, and the adrenaline that had defined the past few hours. Passengers disembarked slowly, glancing back, pointing, whispering to each other. They would remember her forever, recounting the story to friends and family, replaying the moments when a quiet observer had saved them all. Mara didn't seek recognition. Heroes, she reminded herself, were often loud, celebrated, and photographed. She had only done what was necessary, in the right place at the right time. A teenage girl approached, hesitantly, voice barely audible over the rain. "Were you really in the army? How did you do it?" Mara smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough to offer reassurance. "Lots of practice," she said simply. It explained nothing, yet everything at once. The girl nodded slowly, as though that statement alone justified the extraordinary actions she had witnessed, then returned to her family. Investigators and maintenance crews swarmed the aircraft, repairing damage, collecting evidence, and documenting every detail. By the next morning, the plane would be cleared, and passengers would resume travel as if nothing had happened. Yet the memory of that night, the quiet courage of Mara, would linger far longer in their minds. Some stories, once lived, refused to fade. Mara moved to a quiet corner overlooking the runway. The rain fell in sheets, washing the tarmac clean, yet the marks of human conflict remained etched in memory. She reflected on what had happened, the lessons that could not be taught in classrooms or read in manuals. True courage is measured not by how loudly it announces itself, but by the precision, patience, and clarity of action under pressure. She had waited, observed, calculated, and acted. That was all. A flight attendant approached her one last time, eyes wide with admiration. "I just thank you. What you did. I've never seen anything like it." Mara shook her head gently. "You did your job too. Kept calm, kept the cockpit secure. That mattered." The attendant smiled, still unsure how to process the woman who had silently commanded the fate of hundreds. The passengers, the crew, and even the hijackers would remember that night in different ways. Some with awe, some with fear, some with disbelief. But Mara herself carried it lightly, a chapter in a life defined by discipline and preparedness. She had been invisible when the chaos began, quiet when the cabin trembled, and resolute when action was required. The lessons were simple: preparedness, observation, patience, and the knowledge that sometimes the person nobody notices is exactly who everyone needs most. The SEAL commander, Weller, disappeared into the official proceedings, confident that the quiet observer he had relied on would continue to be exactly that: quiet, capable, and ready. The passengers filed through the tarmac, stories forming on every tongue, yet none could fully encapsulate the calm precision that had saved them. Mara took one last glance at the plane. It looked small, fragile, ordinary, yet it had carried a crucible of fear, courage, and split-second decisions that had tested everyone aboard. The rain washed over the fuselage, glistening under emergency lights, as if the world itself acknowledged the extraordinary events contained within. She walked away, unnoticed by most, carrying with her nothing but experience, calm, and a quiet sense of duty fulfilled. Sometimes, heroes don't announce themselves. Sometimes, they simply do what is necessary, then return to obscurity. Row 17 had witnessed such a hero, and in doing so, taught a lesson none would forget. The flight, the passengers, the crew, they would move forward, but the story of the quiet woman who said nothing until the right moment would echo for a lifetime. Because courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it is patient, silent, and precise. Sometimes it waits for the perfect moment. And sometimes, the person no one notices is exactly who brings everyone home.